Welcome back to Connect MKE Conversations on Race. America has a persistent racial wealth gap that is hurting our communities and our economy. According to the Federal Reserve Bank, no real progress has been made in reducing income and wealth disparities between Black and white households over the past 70 years. Institutional and systemic racism and other discriminatory practices have resulted in the net worth of a typical Black family being about 1/10 of a typical white family. U.S. Bank is making significant efforts to close the racial wealth gap. Building Black Wealth is designed to help families access the needed financial resources to build wealth. Joining us to discuss this effort is Scott Ford, President, U.S. Bank Affluent Wealth Management. Let's start with some of the basics. Did I describe the racial wealth gap correctly? And can you talk more about some of the historical factors that got us to where we are today?
You absolutely described it correctly. Your statistics are absolutely spot on. It's been about 70 years since they've been tracking the racial wealth gap between Black households and white households. In fact, the Minneapolis Fed a couple of years ago came out with that precise statement that no meaningful progress had been made in the past 70 years. And we do know that gap has been persistent. And it's just it's a real challenging problem to kind of solve. And that we know that it's about 8-to-1 in terms of the wealth that white families have versus the wealth that Black families have. And much of that is in terms of value of their home as well as the value of financial assets that get transferred from one generation to the next.
One of the things that's important to building wealth is to have a plan where you're going to get started, where you want to go. But some families, some African American families in particular, have an institutional distrust of financial institutions. How is U.S. Bank working to earn that trust so it can begin to work with individuals to build wealth?
Yeah, Denise, great question. One of the insights that we gleaned, or some of the learnings that we walked away with, is, more so than any other ethnic group, African Americans said that they've been mistreated by the financial service industry historically, and so there's an inherent distrust with financial services institutions. They've also said that they want to see themselves represented. So because there's this trust and there's nobody there that looks like me, they believe that, that having more professionals of color, in particular African Americans, would be very helpful. Some of that distrust is born out of things like, for example, redlining, which was the practice of, not lending. And this, many banks and institutions were part of this problem. And, so we want to be part of the solution. But there was a time when banks, as directed by, the federal government, would draw red lines around African American communities and not lend there. And the overall impact of that is the value of the homes in those communities, because you couldn't get financing, was artificially depressed. Right. So that is also one of the things that contributes to the distrust of this community. Also, things like predatory lending practices, where African Americans are charged higher rates than other ethnic groups for the same loans with the same credit scores. So U.S. Bank is really working really hard, to make sure that, number one, we don't engage in any of those practices, and number two, leading in a very deliberate and intentional way to help find solutions to those very challenges.
Building businesses is another way to build wealth and to create a legacy. But Black business owners have historically faced certain barriers to accessing capital and other resources. What are some of the things that Building Black Wealth is doing differently to help Black entrepreneurs and business owners?
Oh, that's actually a really good question, and you're absolutely correct. I mean, part of the reason why the initiative is called Access Commitment is because historically, our folks have not had access, to the resources and the information that they need to, successfully build wealth. And business ownership is certainly one of the ways that, other groups have been able to build wealth historically in this country. And one of the things that we've done is we partnered with a number of organizations across the United States, in particular some nonprofits and some entrepreneurs, to actually make loans available and to make certain grants available so that they would have access to capital and financing. But one of the more recent developments that I would call your attention to is we created a role of specifically business bankers who are dedicated to African-American communities and African-American business owners, specifically to give them advice and guidance as to how they can successfully run their businesses, and more importantly, how they can access the resources that they need to continue to expand and grow their businesses. So that's something I believe that's unique to U.S. Bank that we're doing. And we have about 9 or 10 of them across the country, and they work in close partnership with our retail bank partners and also with our Access Wealth teams, which are comprised folks who are from, financial advisors and private bankers across the United States, to make sure they have access to world-class advice so they can successfully build their companies.
Retirement planning and estate planning are also key. How does the right kind of retirement planning help secure and build wealth?
Well, retirement planning is really important. And here's what many people don't realize, Denise. You could be retired as long or longer than you were working. So, my mom, who's now 81 years old, retired when she was 55. She taught school for 28 years. She's been retired for longer than that, right? So retirement planning is really important because it's really all about how are you going to make sure that the money that you have will last. So, making sure that you have done some planning so that you can have some idea about, how to invest your money today so it grows over time in the future. One of the mistakes that we see in particular with African Americans is we don't take enough risk, right? And we don't take advantage of our company retirement plans like 401ks and 403bs. And when we do take advantage, we don't contribute enough in those plans, right, over time out of our salaries, so that we'll have enough money when we do get to that retirement age. So I would tell you, the first thing you need to do is make sure that you engage in some kind of financial planning exercise. Certainly, you be more than welcome to contact some of our folks in our branches at U.S. Bank Wealth Management. It's a complimentary service, and they're more than willing to help you sit down and figure out where you are. But that's a really, really important aspect of making sure that you will have enough money in retirement to retire with dignity.
And estate planning is important if you're trying to move wealth from one generation to the next.
That's exactly right. It's the estate planning with some of the recent tax changes, and this is not meant to be tax advice, but at $12 million, any assets that you have above $12 million will be subject to federal estate taxes. And those federal estate taxes range anywhere from 18% to 40%, which is significant. And many states also have a estate tax. It's also sometimes referred to as a death tax. And so think about this. Perhaps you own, a family farm, right? And that land could be valued at, well above $12 million, but just because of the acreage, or you own some real estate. So it's really not that hard, as much as it might seem. It's not that hard to be above that asset level. And that could potentially decimate a family's income, but the assets, because you would have to sell off those assets to pay that federal estate tax, because most people are not going to have the cash sitting around. But estate planning is really about how you plan for those estate taxes and how you can, do things like buy insurance policies, which could be a funding vehicle to pay the estate tax, or there are things you could do in terms of the structure of your estate to make sure that you keep it under those levels. So that kind of goes hand in hand with financial planning, but it's generally speaking, it's for people that have accumulated more assets over time. But again, really important to do it.
What is one thing people can do today to get started to building wealth?
Oh, one of the most important things I would suggest is, number one, I'm a firm believer you got to have a financial plan. Think about if you were going to drive across country, you would not just leave your house and try to wing it. You would have some idea about how you're going to get there, and that's really what financial planning is all about. But one of the essential things I would suggest that people do is have a savings plan, right? 47% of all Americans could not come up with $400 in the event of an emergency. So what happens if, your boiler breaks or the hot water heater breaks? Now you've got to go and put that on high interest credit card that you might not have the money to pay off. And so you're paying for that thing over a long period of time. So I would say, get in a financial plan, make sure you have an emergency fund, and save and invest systematically over time, and you will be surprised how you could build wealth. Those are some very simple things that you could do to build wealth over time.
Great advice, Scott Ford of U.S. Bank and Building Black Wealth. Thank you so much for joining us and for the work that you are doing to make our families and our communities stronger.
Thanks, Denise. It was great to chat with you.
When we return, we'll learn about a century-old organization that has empowered communities and changed lives for African Americans living in the greater Milwaukee area. My conversation with Greater Milwaukee Urban League President and CEO, Dr. Eve Hall, is next.